What lessons can we learn from the 2024 season? A lot. We can also overthink some things. Well, we're going to tackle that today by using some great data right here on the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I am Chris Welsh, joined today, two of the best that you could possibly ask for. I've got Pat Fitzmaurice and Andrew Erickson with me as we are going to be tackling some big questions. So what lessons did we learn? We're going to get it from these guys. Plus, we have aggregated some data from my playbook, which you guys should know all about here with Fantasy Pros. And we have the players that were on the most championship roster, and we are going to be dissecting that. We're actually going to give you the all championship team. How funny that is, because all these guys had to be on championships. Well, we're going to give you the highest collection of them. We're going to talk about what lessons we learned from that. We're going to look at 2024 ADP, where those lessons were, positional stuff. Boys, school's in session. That's what we are. We've got Professor Fitzmaurice. Pat, what's up, buddy?
Doing well, Welsh. How about you? Are you enjoying the NFL playoffs so far?
Not Monday night's football game that we just watched, but there were a couple that were enjoyable. We're recording this, obviously, right after the first divisional round, Monday's game, where the Vikings just the whole thing up, and it wasn't very enjoyable. My pocketbook, as I've said a million times, Erickson knows this, if I just stuck to the bets I publicly gave everybody, I would be a massively successful bettor if I just only followed my public advice. But I go rogue. I get out there, it's Call of Duty, it's Nuketown, and I'm like, all right, I got to do this and I got to do that. And I just get nuts with it, Erickson. I don't know if you follow your only trends, but I'm a rogue agent in the betting world, and it's hurting me.
Yeah, I know. Once you start, the bullets are firing, and you're just like, oh, I like this one. Oh, I like this one. And you're like, no, you need to step away from the computer, turn off the smartphone, and walk away and be like, I like these bets on Thursday and then Friday, and the process was good. And now I don't need to go after this 20% profit boost that X and O is offering, because it's probably not going to happen in this particular game. So let's just take the steps back. But Matthew Stafford somehow didn't get over his passing yards, which I was very happy about, even though he was dealing. But when you lose your number one receiver in Tyler Higbee, I mean, that's the result you get. So I didn't hate the game, because I did like the unders, but Justin Jefferson not going over 6.5 catches when he had, I think, 5 in the first half.
5 catches in the first half. Everybody knows
brutal.
You don't throw to Jefferson in the second half. Clearly, that's what you don't do. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Well, hey, lessons learned. That's what this is all about. Lessons learned. Playoff betting is brutal, but we're not here to talk about betting. We are talking about the fantasy season, and we have got all this stuff in store. So like I said, I will just be the facilitator. I'm the voice on the screen telling you when it's lunchtime and when school is out. Here are your two professors, and both of these guys are going to be able to break down some big questions that you can take into the new year and into your off season in preparation, because every single year it's a different process of like, here's where quarterbacks are. Do we trust the high end tight ends, wide receivers versus running backs? A lot of those are tackled. And let's kick this bad boy off. Let's just jump right into it with our first piece, where we are going to dig into this My Playbook data. So again, My Playbook with Fantasy Pros, you can sync your leagues in season, all of the great tools available for you. It also allows us to be able to pull what players were on championship rosters and be able to aggregate that data. So I've got this spreadsheet with percentage totals and all this fun stuff, but I decided to make a team out of it. So here is your all championship roster. So all the top players that made it, gentlemen. Our quarterback, this is actually the second overall player that was on rosters. Our quarterback is going to be Jaden Daniels. Probably no shocker there. Running back is going to start with the number one player on championship rosters. Think of how many leagues this is across different formats. The number one player, Jahmyr Gibbs, who is still alive. Our second running back, Saquon Barkley. Wide receivers, though, don't quite look like the running backs, where you've got two high-end Gibbs and Barkley. That might be 1 and 2 in a lot of streets. But our wide receivers are not. We've got T. Higgins and Brian Thomas, who actually had the same percentage. So I added a third wide receiver, McMillan. Jalen McMillan comes in as our third wide receiver. So T. Higgins, Brian Thomas, Jalen McMillan. Our tight ends were shared. McBride and Bowers both had the same percentage of championship teams, so high-end tight end. And our defense, gentlemen, the Miami Dolphins, just like everybody wrote it up, that they thought that would be that. So here's my question. And Fitzy, let's start with you. What's the biggest standout of this roster of championship players? I don't really think I left anybody off, just FYI. There's a couple more, like where the Dolphins are. There's a couple more quarterbacks that show up, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow. There's some other interesting names that we're going to be talking about that are going to be intertwined in this later. But when you look at that roster of the most rostered players in championship, it's no shock to see big names. What is your takeaway? Higher first round running backs maybe being more valuable, the cheaper chalk wide receivers and their performance and making it this far. Chalk tight ends, by the way. How about 1 and 2 at tight end and still were ranked pretty high? Upside quarterbacks and a guy like Jaden Daniel. I'm just throwing out some ideas. Pick a standout here from the most rostered on championship teams for this session.
Yeah, there were a few. I mean, getting tight end right was really important. And I don't know if those guys were necessarily chalk because Brock Bowers had an ADP of tight end 11 coming into the season. He did finish as a top 2 tight end. That was great. Making investments in rookies was pretty important and getting some of these guys right. And it wasn't like the guys who fared well in their rookie year were unpredictable. We were talking about a lot of these guys back in August. Jaden Daniels with his running ability and, probably a much more advanced passer coming into the league than, say, Anthony Richardson. Bowers, who we thought was a really extraordinary tight end prospect. Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas and Ladd McConkey, who a lot of people love. I think the one thing that stands out most to me, though, Welsh, was that when you look at these guys who were most frequently rostered by championship teams, the production in weeks 15 through 17, the playoff weeks, was like weighted more so than what these players did in weeks 1 through 14. I mean, it was like walking into a college class and getting the syllabus and learning that you're going to have some papers, you're going to have some pop quizzes, there's going to be a midterm, but the final exam is 60% of your grade. And if you knew that in advance, you would think, like, I'm going to study my tail off for this final exam. But can you study it? Like, is this based on matchups that these guys rocked out in the playoff weeks? And not always. Like, I'll give you an example. So Lamar Jackson rostered on 14% of championship teams. Josh Allen only 9%. So 2 guys who were great in the fantasy regular season, but Lamar had a really good playoff. Let's see, 36.1, 21.5, and 29.4 fantasy points in the 3 playoff weeks. And Josh Allen, he had a 12.2 point performance in week 16 that probably tripped up a lot of his fantasy teams. And like, was that predictable? I don't know, because one of the teams Lamar was going against during that great stretch, Pittsburgh, not a great matchup. Josh Allen, like the game where he tripped up and had 12.2 points, the New England Patriots.
That's what I was going to ask you, by the way. I like, as you were going, I was like, well, there kind of is a way to tell. We could look at the matchups and we could rate the matchups, because ultimately I was like, does this come back to paying greater attention to the playoff roster or the playoff schedule for a guy in draft season? It's very hard to do. But then you just debunked it. You just debunked in a great way that it's like, oh, where is a predictability? Because, yeah, you would think Josh Allen's going to go off and Lamar Jackson, historically struggles against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So, where's the application? I know you were kind of rhetorically asking it, and I'm like physically asking it, like, where's the application of knowing the difference between Allen and Lamar Jackson? Because you're right. It's so heavily weighted.
The key, though, Welsh, like, is it predictably, like, are these matchups predictably good or predictably bad? Like Jahmyr Gibbs just completely crushed it in the 3 postseason weeks. Like, he just piled up points. His opponents those weeks, Buffalo, Chicago, San Francisco. Yes, all 3 of those teams were among the 5 teams that allowed the most fantasy points to running backs this season. But would you have predicted? We knew Buffalo was a little soft against the run. Chicago, maybe not as predictable. San Francisco, definitely not as predictable. Jonathan Taylor's on this list. He tore up the Titans and Giants defenses. They were in the top 10 as far as most points allowed to running backs. But they were also in the top half of the league in DVOA against the run. And I don't think anyone would have thought coming into this season that the Titans were going to be a pushover as far as run defense when they were pretty good last year. So you can study this stuff to an extent in August, I'm not going to say it's not important to consider defenses and look ahead towards those playoff matchups. I know people in best ball especially pay heavy attention to that when they're drafting their teams, but not always foolproof, not always predictable.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, the application is kind of the tough thing about what you're saying too, because I think a lot of these guys that are on this list, they're studs, so it's like, who cares if who cares in a way of like Saquon Barkley was amazing all season, even if him being on the championship roster was weighted in those final 3 weeks. That makes sense. But there are two names that stand out here. Brian Thomas was a player of like getting in on because he just blew up in the second half, and McMillan was a really tough one to kind of be able to put your finger on that he was going to break out. But playing on the side of talent and buying on those, Erickson, we talked about, like Brian Thomas a ton on the prediction and buy and sell trade show all year long, that it really did pay off at the end. There's a lot of studs. Erickson, your takeaway, like I said, I threw out some, first round running backs, cheaper wide receivers, tight ends, just as ideas. What's your takeaway, especially? You could talk about the whole sheet or the all on your championship roster team that we put together. Give us a big takeaway.
So I agree with Fitz when it comes to looking at this list of players and drafting rookies, right? I think that it's kind of twofold, where you have rookies that can hit immediately and break out, kind of like the Malik Neighbors, or you also have ones that finish the season strong. You see a lot of rookies after they get, the post-rookie bye week, they get more involved in the offense, and that's obviously talking about players like Brian Thomas Jr. or Jalen McMillan, where you saw them really be forces down the stretch when they got more opportunities or whatever. So I think that drafting rookies always is a winning strategy, no matter what year it is. Other things to point out when we're talking about projecting matchups. Now, this goes into adjusting your roster throughout the season, not just when it comes to like waiver wire, but when it comes to trades. Obviously, we did the trade show this year, Welsh, and I remember we were pounding the table every single week. It was like, we got to buy Eagles players. We got to buy Buccaneers players, because after weeks 8, 9, 10, it seemed very clear that, these teams have smash matchups in the fantasy football playoffs. So seeing a Detroit Lions player, because the Lions get another team that had a smash matchup. Now, it's hard because, yes, they are studs at the same time. So you have to trade your studs to get these studs with like the favorable playoff matchup. So it wasn't super easy, but at least with the Buccaneers, and I know that Bucky Irving is not on this list. I know he's like a little bit farther down, but he was another player that you could definitely look at as, he was on a lot of championship winning rosters, because not only did he take over the backfield, but he played on the Buccaneers. They played the Panthers. They played the Saints. They played a lot of really bad teams, and that helped him really pole vault some of these teams to their championship. So along the side with Jalen McMillan as well, where, hey, rookie, he was banged up earlier in the season, got healthy, got favorable matchups down the stretch, and you saw a lot of Buccaneers players really cook towards the end of the season. So I think that you can have an element of what the matchups are rest of the season when you are making and playing in the trade market. And honestly, like the FantasyPros strength of schedule tool, like this is what it told me. Like every single week, I'm like, Eagles, Buccaneers, like at the top.
By the way,
of the list,
Brian Thomas, I believe, was like number one best matchup rating, I think, through the end of the year, if I'm remembering that correctly. We screamed about Brian Thomas on that. So can I ask you guys real quick before we move on from this? Do you have an applicable time that people maybe next year should start checking in and maybe preemptively making moves based on schedules and looking at those schedules? Obviously, it'd be great if everyone could pay attention to a preseason before we get going. But do you think like week 8, week 10, week 6, like what would be, if you could just give an arbitrary number to it, where you think you might be ahead of the curve if you started paying attention to those schedules? Erickson, let's start with you.
I think I have to go back and read some of my fantasy forecasts to kind of see the first week that I pinpointed, the Buccaneers have a good schedule. Like this, maybe that's what I kind of need to do, and just look back and see, okay, this is when it first came into, I acknowledged it, that this was a favorable schedule, because I think it's probably better to be a week early than a week too late, because again, if you're a week too late, then you can't make the deal. Like they won't want a deal, or you buy the player after a bad week. Saquon has a bad game, just not the top of people's minds. So I would say it's probably around that midsection, probably at least a couple weeks before the trade deadline itself, because that's when everyone, I think, is looking. So that's something I'm going to try to keep make a reminder to myself on my wall. Hey, week 8, make sure you're looking at the playoff schedule, stay a week ahead so you can make some of these trades. So you can land a Saquon, you can land a Jahmyr Gibbs. Again, Gibbs also, we didn't mention it, but I mean, his breakout at the end, or not really breakout, but the way he smashed, I mean, Dave Montgomery didn't play. right? So like it was like the perfect storm for Gibbs to just take over and score a bazillion fantasy points because his schedule was there. There was no backfield competition, and the Lions offense was cooking for this number 1 seed. So it worked out perfectly for Gibbs. So I mean, you could have traded a Barkley for a Gibbs type player, and technically that would have been the right move because Gibbs scored more points during the fantasy championship. So maybe that's not the best example of what player you should have moved, but just going back to, maybe it is that midweek or the mid-season, week 8, week 7, where you really start to look at these playoff matchups because maybe by then we kind of know these teams 2 months in.
Yeah, week 8 was the one that was like arbitrarily in my head. Fitzy, what do you think? A little bit later, a little bit early, just right?
No, I think week 7 and week 8 is great because the closer you get to the trade deadline, the more focused other managers are going to be on what those playoff schedules look like. And yet we want to give things time to normalize. We can't really draw firm conclusions about how good defenses are in week 3. I think we need a month to a month and a half of data before we can start drawing some pretty solid conclusions about how good defenses are. Week 7, week 8, that does seem like a pretty perfect timetable.
All right, next up, class. Our presentation, we are going to look at our 2024 ADP. So we've got a graphic here of what our ADP look like. So the top 4 relative disappointments to big disappointments who did not justify their cost: Christian McCaffrey, Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, Breece Hall. The top 2 blatantly did not. CeeDee Lamb losing, Dak obviously hurt. Breece was kind of, there were moments, but yeah, we're going to call them all relatively big disappointments. 5 through 14 on this board performed at or like above expectations, or even if we want to, knock off the other 2 of Puka and Jahmyr Gibbs and just look at it like as a top 12, at or above expectations. So knowing what we know now, in 2025, would you prefer to have a first overall pick, 1 or 2 even, or a later pick that would allow you to draft another elite option at the turn? Fitzy, let's go back to you here. So high pick or later pick to kind of stack some of the value that's going to be out there?
I think I'd be okay with picking anywhere in 2025. Like, I don't know if we can draw any firm conclusions about like which part of the draft was ideal to draft in. I think in 2024 it was actually near the turn, which was where Jahmyr Gibbs and Saquon Barkley were going. Like AJ Brown, even Justin Jefferson was sliding towards the back half of the first round in some drafts. That turned out to be a pretty good spot. And there were a lot of landmines at the top with Christian McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill, but no 2 years are quite the same. Everyone likes to get 101, 102. People are happy when they draw those picks, and I don't think anyone's going to be complaining about having a chance to get Jamar Chase or Saquon Barkley next year. But yeah, I mean, there's some value to waiting 2 and double tapping with 2 pretty good assets.
But it sounds like you're not going to let anything that happened this year wait where you want to pick in the first round. Okay.
No.
Erickson, same question. I would even, I don't know, there's a semi-argument to be like, I don't even think it's a question that last year the wheel was incredible to get like a Saquon and Jahmyr Gibbs. And I look at it this year, it's kind of lined up similarly again. A guy like Jonathan Taylor is going to be floating around there. And we do see like these high-end running backs. If I were to let what happened last year affect any roles of what I would want coming this year, I think the one thing would be like, boy, that laddery area, 10, 11, 12, still looks really, really good to last year. But Erickson, that's me. What say you? No effect whatsoever? Or do you take any of the failures at the top and the hits at the bottom as a reference for 2025?
I guess the way I'm looking at it, and this is something I talked about in my perfect draft strategy heading into the 2024 season, was make sure you're not drafting last year's winning team. Because when you look at the top 3 picks from this past year's fantasy season, those are the best picks in the first round the year before. Christian McCaffrey, Tyreek Hill, and CeeDee Lamb, they were all in that first round conversation entering 2023 drafts. They all smashed wherever you end up getting them in the first round. Now, they weren't the top 3 picks, but Lamb, I think, was at the turn with Amon-Ra St. Brown. Tyreek Hill was also a middle first round pick. McCaffrey wasn't the first running back, but he was still like in that 4 or 5 range. And then they all smashed and they all went 1, 2, 3 the next year. So that's kind of how I'm looking at this, where I just want to make sure that I'm not, and the player that comes to mind is Saquon, right? To me, it seems like 2024 was the year to draft Saquon. he rushed for 2,000 yards. It was the perfect, like, I'm very skeptical he's going to be able to do it again. And now he's going to be the number 1 overall pick. So that concerns me about, do I want Saquon Barkley in 2025 when he just had his best year ever in 2024? So that's something I just want to keep in mind. So that's kind of how I'm approaching it. So again, similar to Fitz, I'm not stringent to I have to draft here. And I know it kind of feels warm and fuzzy where you're like, well, if I don't pick at the top, I can't mess it up, right? I'll just let the value fall to me. But I still really like Chase a lot, right? So I don't want to miss out on an opportunity to draw Ja'Marr Chase. I don't know where Bijan is going to go necessarily. I'm really excited for Bijan. Like, he could be my number 1 overall player. And if I don't have the number 1 overall pick, I might not get him if I don't have a top 3 pick, depending on where ADP shakes out. So I think for me, it's less about where I'm picking and where about who do I want and who can I get at the cheapest price. I know heading into this year, I liked picking 104 because I felt like I didn't really want to get Lamb, McCaffrey, or Hill because I liked Brees, Chase, and Bijan more than those guys. So I was like, give me 104 and I'll take one of those 3 guys. And that worked out, for the most part, except for in the case of Brees Hall. But
I
Chase
feel
and
like
obviously Bijan were good.
you want that again. I was sitting here thinking as you were talking, I'm like, man, if you get 4, it's like you're going to get one of Jahmyr, Saquon, Bijan, or Jahmyr Gibbs, or Jefferson if you want to throw that in. I feel like 1-4 is in that same territory. And I think it's fair to, rightfully, you don't want to like just blindly be like, oh, well, the top 4 failed last year, I don't want to have a top 4. It's based on what the player pool looks like. But, the trends are super interesting. And maybe the one big takeaway there is you have a better opportunity of not messing it up and have some high upside when you are at the back end. If they're, if we truly were taking one big takeaway from that, we've still got more takeaway and lessons learned. But first, playoffs. We're talking about NFL playoffs. You bet we are. Get in on the action at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Scoring touchdowns is key to winning in the NFL playoffs, and the key to you scoring big is betting on them at DraftKings, the number 1 place to bet touchdowns. Ready to place your first bet? Try betting on something simple like a player's to score 6. Go to DraftKings Sportsbook app and make your pick. It's a big playoff weekend. There are a ton of minus money touchdown calls, but guess what? Josh Allen staring at you right in the face at plus 110. Here's another reason to watch your favorite players crush it in the playoffs. New customers bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Score big during the NFL playoffs with DraftKings Sportsbook. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code FantasyPros. That's code FantasyPros for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Gentlemen, let's go to our third area here and let's talk about quarterbacks. Which approach to the quarterback position in draft likely paid off the most? Grabbing an elite quarterback early, grabbing a mid-tier option in the middle rounds, or building a strong roster led by 1 or 2 late-round quarterbacks? This is kind of an open-ended one because one could argue in some spots that later quarterback of 1-2 could have been Jaden Daniels and somebody else. In the same token, at the end of the draft season, we saw Jaden Daniels moving up to 5. I kind of feel like Jaden Daniels owns this conversation and where we steer it, except the next 2 quarterbacks, which are inside the top 15 most rostered players, were Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson. So, I mean, those are some higher end quarterbacks in that top 6, that higher tier. You're not seeing, Joe Flacco's or anything like that. So, Erickson, let's start with you on this one. 2024 to 25, what approach are you going to take? What lessons did we learn from this season on drafting quarterbacks in the new year?
I think it's still late round quarterback. And I don't think it necessarily means, oh, you got to draft a quarterback in the double-digit rounds. I think it means you want to get the last quarterback in those tiers of elite. Lamar Jackson, I checked, he was QB4 ADP. So he went behind Hurts and Josh Allen and Mahomes. So even though you were drafting an elite quarterback, you were getting an elite quarterback upside at the best price. Joe Burrow, kind of falling into that pocket passer. Well, he was cheaper than CJ Stroud, right? So again, you're still finding ways to get value with some of these quarterbacks by waiting, by being patient. If someone else wants to draft Lamar Jackson as the QB1 overall, let them do it. And then, okay, I'm going to adjust my strategy. I'm not going to go for that first tier of quarterback anymore, or I'll let Josh Allen, if Josh Allen falls to the 4th quarterback, then I will take him. So I think it's still trying to get value because with quarterbacks, we know that, they touch the ball all the same. It's not about opportunity. It's about, well, how good is this guy? And then do they run? what's the offensive environment like? And I thought this year in particular was just such a smash for late round quarterback. Because, I mean, my best team this year drafted Anthony Richardson, bust. My team won because I drafted Jane Daniels. Like, so I got bailed out by following the late round quarterback approach because I knew Richardson was very volatile, and it worked out for me. And then not even him, but Baker Mayfield. He was a top 5 quarterback.
Yeah.
Sam Darnold left for dead.
Goff.
And then he was still available after like a couple of weeks. Yeah, Jared Goff. So I still think going after value is the best way. And that doesn't necessarily mean, hey, you have to draft a quarterback in double digit rounds. Like, no, draft your quarterback with a value proposition. Don't just, oh, I got to take the first guy. I got to get Lamar, got to get Josh Allen. It's like, no, there are so many pockets in every single draft where you can find value at quarterback. So that's kind of my main takeaway is like, you can still get value at this position while paying up for the skill position players a little bit more, where the value doesn't necessarily seem so as obvious.
Yeah, I think it's well said. I think there's a couple things in there. Jaden Daniels still floats because I don't think we can really talk about late round quarterback with Jaden Daniels because of how he ended up going like 5 and 6 at quarterback. So he kind of gets that mid tier, but you labeled a couple of the guys, Baker Mayfield, Jared Goff, Darnold for a period of time. Those were huge. Those were huge wins if, you had made some investments in the wrong areas. But I will say, I take your value proposition to give me the cheapest, best value of that middle to higher tier quarterback. And that was like a Jaden Daniels or a Joe Burrow. They kind of sit in that area. I also don't want to spend the high end, but I don't know if I want to wait and hope that I hit on a Baker Mayfield. I like that middle area, but I'm not really sure anything's changed for me on that. Pat, what say you? Is there anything different there? Is it all late round, or does that middle tier feel really good? Or do you want to just do that high investment on the Lamars and the Josh Allens?
Erickson said it really well that we want to suss out value when we start to go through some drafts and see where quarterbacks are typically landing in those drafts. And Jaden Daniels was a terrific draft value this year. We knew he was going to provide that rushing value. And I do think we want to be mindful of rushing value in a lot of cases. I mean, I hate to say it, but I would think that Anthony Richardson might be a draft value next year because a lot of people are going to be totally out on him. And he still has that rushing value. And yes, the passing output is going to be really inconsistent and troublesome at times. But man, I think he's going to be, unlike this year where he turned out to not be a value at his draft cost. I think next year there's a good chance he could be. And I know he doesn't run a lot. I'm thinking Dak Prescott could be a value for 2025 as a guy who is playing on a team that's probably going to add and already has one of the best receivers in football, is probably going to add another pass catcher and has a defense that seems to be headed in the wrong direction. Might have to play a lot of shootouts next year. And plus a guy who's just going to be sort of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of people after missing most of 2024. So yes, I think we are looking for value and we're looking for running ability, but that's the thing. Like Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson are awesome, and they're probably going to continue to be awesome. But do I want to spend a late second or early third round pick on them? Not really.
Yeah, and the pairing might be good too. If you have any type of inherent risk and you can go later, you could have taken a Baker Mayfield. Hell, Bryce Young might be a good quarterback for next season as well as far as the value goes. We have been talking about some rookies, so we're going to have a rookie conversation. This one, we're going to maybe focus a little bit more on the pass catchers. Let's save that other position for the next question. Of the top 10 players on championship rosters, 4 of the top 10 overall are rookies. We've talked about Jaden Daniels, Brian Thomas, McMillan, and Neighbors. Neighbors also is someone we haven't talked about. Those 4 of the top 10 making it as the most rostered players. By the way, we scroll down. You guys know, you looked at the data, you start to see more. Lad McConkey is down there. There's handfuls of more. There's a couple other rookie wide receivers. So the question is, does this make you feel even more comfortable drafting rookies high in your fantasy drafts in 2025? But I want to throw a caveat at you. The top dog, Marvin Harrison, big, fat, stinky failure. There couldn't be a bigger failure from a fantasy perspective, especially comparative to all those other guys. So you guys both have already kind of stated, you're into rookies, and it's more of a reason to draft rookies, specifically pass catchers. You can throw tight ends in this as well. Brock Bowers, one of those guys on those rosters, up on the list. Does this year make you feel more confident in drafting your pass catching rookies for next year, even though the number one guy was a failure, Pat?
Big no, because this is not the caliber of the wide receiver class that we had last year. Last year's wide receiver class was very extraordinary, and I think we knew that coming in. This year's wide receiver class, murkier. There's some top end talent like Tet McMillan. I think everyone loves as a prospect, and a lot of people are going to like Luther Burden and Emeka Egbuka, and I think those guys are probably going to be first round picks in the NFL draft. But we don't have the top end talent or the depth of the class of 2024 coming to us in 2025. So I think we have to pump the brakes a little bit on this rookie class. There's still going to be some guys we like. And by the way, Welsh, I do have to take exception with the idea that Marvin Harrison is like a huge failure relative to expectations. And I think just because the second round of 2024 drafts was so confusing, I feel like Marvin Harrison sort of got pushed into that range relative to his draft cost. A disappointment, absolutely. But then you look and see that his rookie numbers were eerily similar to those of his Hall of Fame dad. And no one was like dismissing his dad after year one. So yeah, also a little disappointing when you compare him to some of the other rookies who hit the ground running, Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, Ladd McConkey. But I'm not totally out on Marvin Harrison Jr. I just clearly a disappointment for 2024. Yes. But like, as far as a failure, I don't know about that.
Yeah, I mean, agree to disagree. Like where's he being drafted this coming year? He was second round. Do you think he's going to be inside the top 10 rounds?
Oh, top 10 rounds?
Or like eight, like what round? Give me a round.
Probably like 5 or 6.
Okay. I mean, and that's not that big. Erickson, do you think that's around where Marvin goes? 5 or 6?
I think he'd be higher, to be honest. I mean, we pump this guy. I mean, I think that Fitz hit the nail on the head. Like, it's our fault. It's the Royal We's fault that he was a bust because we put him in the first round, like the end of the first round, second round. And this is something that I've gone back to when I'm looking at fantasy football receivers to avoid. It's the guy that gets the most hype that has yet to actually break out at the NFL level is the guy that busts every single year. And Marvin Harrison checked that box off when I was writing about him as a fantasy football wide receiver to avoid, right next to Nico Collins, which I was totally wrong about. But that was the red flag. It wasn't even about him. Again, look at his final stat line: 62 catches, 885 yards, 8 touchdowns. You're like, oh, that's like pretty good for a rookie. Well, not a rookie that you draft. And I know Fitz brought up comparing to his dad. His dad also wasn't a fringe first round pick in fantasy as a rookie. Right. So like, that's why it's warped the perception of Marvin Harrison because yeah, he killed you where you drafted him, because we should not have been pushing him up there. Why was he should have been going where Malik Neighbors was going. Because you look about,
would that have been better though? If he went where Malik Neighbors were, you would feel more confident that like this wasn't a bust of a season.
Yeah, 100%. I think it would have been way different, because imagine because drafting the rookie that high. Well, if you had drafted Brian Thomas Jr. instead of Marvin Harrison at the 1-2 turn, you would have looked like a genius, right? When it all said and done, like people have been like, "What are you doing?" It's like we put the wrong rookie there, and that just goes back to when we're hyping up these unproven players to an extent where it was almost impossible for him to meet expectations because we put them so high on the certain players. So I think that ties back to my lesson learned. Well, besides like the hyped up rookie or any receiver, anything, I'm kind of taking Harrison just not even being a rookie. Just the fact that he was just an overhyped wide receiver in a brand new situation with a new quarterback we've never seen him play with before. I think that was an aggressive leap of faith. But it goes back to when it comes to rookies, especially pass catchers, you want the discount, right? That's the whole point. That's why we love rookies, because you can get them later on because they're unproven. But with Marvin Harrison Jr., that wasn't ever part of the conversation, which is why I always argued, why draft Harrison when you can get the same rookie upside with Malik Neighbors in round 4, with Brian Thomas Jr. in round 7, with Ladd McConkey. And like, that was always my argument. So when rookies get priced so expensively, well, you're losing on half of the value of a rookie. And that's because they're cheaper, because they're unproven. So that's kind of like my main takeaway when it comes to the Harrison thing. Like, not even just looking at him as a rookie, but just as an overpriced wide receiver in general. I think that was more of his problem, not that he was a first year player.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, he finished 42nd in points per game, half PPR wide receiver. So that's still not, I mean, it's not horrible. So maybe like me saying it's a big fat failure isn't as fair, but it's 42nd. So that's still not super great. To your guys' point, it's hard when you compare like the old Marvin Harrison and then now take that old Marvin Harrison, have a bunch of Jerry Rices around him. It's like Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors, like all these guys are these huge, big, stars that produce big. This wasn't really meant to be a Marvin Harrison thing, more in that like, there is inherent risk. And maybe the real conversation of this is the overpaying price of any of those rookies like Marvin, like you guys have both said. Malik Neighbors benefit. Brian Thomas was a huge benefit. Think about where Brock Bowers is going relative to him. The excitement that we built up, let him fail. But I would also say, like, I guess that was fine of a season, but 42 at wide receiver is worse than all of those other rookie wide receivers. So, and there might be, by the way, there might be a guy or two in this that, like, I see one name, so let's call him 41. That shouldn't count. But from a per game standpoint, like, he was well under them. That is going to lead us to a nice, more fun, big question surrounded it. But first, we've got a special offer for you guys all. You can unlock a month of Betting Pros Premium for free. Download the Betting Pros app today. Use code FP free. Get access to tools like the Same Game Parlay tool, the Prop Bet Analyzer, and Props and Prize Picks Prop Bet Cheat Sheet. It's easier to do than say, and don't miss out. You can try it for free for 1 month, available on iOS and Android today. Go and download and get access to all those tools to make your bets. Plus, you can use the Betting Pros app just to experiment with betting. You don't actually have to like sync your books to it and make bets. You can go and track your own betting. It's a pretty valuable tool, and you can access all of those great tools with promo code FPFree. Okay, let's go back to rookies again. Funny other thing I want to add with Marvin Harrison that is more to your guys' point. In total points, 29th at wide receiver in half PPR. So that might be a little bit more benefit to what you guys are talking about as well for the Marvin Harrison argument. Much lower in per game. Lots of guys that didn't end up playing. He did end up being like at least a wide receiver 3. But what we did not talk about there were running backs. We saw no running backs on that list, not even sniffing remotely close. Does Ashton Jeanty buck this trend? This is actually going right up against the fear of what you guys were both talking about. Fitzy, you and I did a show with Jake Seeley talking about the first round, and Jake put Jeanty in this. So I'm going to ask you, we saw no running backs last year. Running back can be fickle, especially from a rookie standpoint, but sometimes these guys do that. Erickson, let's start with you on this. Do you think Jeanty is going to buck the trend, or is he setting up to be the next Marvin Harrison?
Well, I would want to point out that, and I should have mentioned this when we were talking about Harrison, that rookie receivers are different from rookie running backs. Like, I think that's Marvin Harrison Jr. was the most expensive rookie receiver ever in fantasy football. Like, again, going back to
that's true, isn't it? Yeah.
How ludicrous his price was on draft day. That's not the case with rookie running. I mean, we've seen rookie running backs dropped in: Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, Bijan Robinson. Now, again, he didn't pay off his rookie ADP when he was like a top 5 pick, but he wasn't like, oh my God, this was the worst pick I ever made. Where Marvin Harrison, you definitely felt that a lot more than when you drafted Bijan in 2023.
Yeah.
So, no, I mean, if he gets the ideal landing spot, like, and just to the running back class in general, we got to remember last year's running class was terrible. It was not a good in the aggregate. I mean, Jonathan Brooks was the first guy drafted and he was injured, right? Like that. That's
like 5 plays. It felt like.
Exactly. So we really got like one major hit, and it was Bucky Irving. And again, he was a guy that was a day 3 pick, and he carved out a big role in the Buccaneers offense. They went away from White. He had a good schedule, and then he smashed down the stretch. This year's class is way different. So it's kind of the opposite, where last year's rookie class, very good in the receivers, not so much in the running backs. You're kind of getting the opposite here. So we got to adjust accordingly. We can't just copy and paste. Well, all the rookie receivers were really good in 2024. Let's draft them all again really aggressively. Not necessarily the case. And the same thing with the running backs, where last year's class, we knew going in, hey, this isn't as good as a class as we usually tend to see, and not as good as, at least from my limited knowledge of looking at these potential prospects, that this 2025 rookie running back class is much better. I'm sure that Fitz can probably shed some more light on that as well.
Fitzy, what do you think? Is Jeanty this year's Marvin Harrison? And that is from a not meeting the expectation if he goes in the first round.
No, I think whoever drafts him is going to do so intending for him to be a workhorse running back, whether it's Dallas, the Chargers. He's going to come in and have a heavy load right away, and I think he's going to be as good as advertised. So I don't think he's going to be a trap, but this running back class goes way beyond Ashton Genty and Erickson nailed it. Like the class of 2024 at running back, not that good. This class is an absolute candy store. It's going to involuntarily retire a lot of fringy veteran running backs. It is deep. It is really talented. And I think people should take advantage of sort of the fog that's created by this volume of excellent RB prospects. And they're going to be guys who slide through the cracks into the double-digit rounds in fantasy drafts. Jump on these Devin Neal types who people are going to be paying attention to Genty, as well as guys like, the Ohio State duo with Quinshon Judkins, Travion Henderson, but like it's so much more than that. And people should be willing to, look deeper, because I think they're going to be like close to 20 really interesting running backs coming out of this class.
If you
it's that deep.
And if you were not already following Fitzy, you need to make sure to lock in, because Fitzy is locked in and he is going to school you on all these guys. So make sure you are ready to get it, because we are not going to take last year's prospect running back class over to this year. As you said, it looks like there's going to be a lot more value and maybe a guy or two that's going to pop up on a championship team.
And by the way, if I can do some cross promotion, Welsh, this week on our Dynasty show, our mutual friend Scott Bogman and I are going to be doing a pretty deep dive with Ryan Wormley on this year's rookie class. So anyone who wants to learn more about the class of 2025 for fantasy might want to check out that show.
Make sure
extra
you check
credit,
it out.
Extra credit with Boggs and Fitz.
That's right.
After class.
Oh, actually, that's right.
Staying after, baby.
It's not detention. If I bring up Marvin Harrison again, I'm going to go into detention. But that one is a good one. All right, let's go to number 6 on this list, tight end scarcity. So this is going to get Fitzy rolling again here. Did tight end scarcity matter? How did the top tight ends and ADP perform and impact fantasy rosters this year overall? To your point, I said chalk and you were right. McBride was the chalk tight end, but Bowers wasn't. Bowers ended up just like quickly became like the number one guy. So you had a value tight end with huge upside. You had McBride at the top. We saw failure. I guess I'm gonna be careful about using the word failure, but we had like failure tight ends across the board on the back end. That then leveled out. It was like all of a sudden I was like, oh, TJ Hawkinson's like doing good. And then like, these guys were working, but doing the late tight end thing didn't really feel well and didn't do good. So Fitzy, does tight end scarcity matter? And really that's just about your drafting next year. Maybe a better way to phrase this than it was phrased was, do you need to do the high end tight end again?
That's an interesting question, Walsh. I had tricked myself in 2024 into thinking that there was depth at tight end. So that was a big whiff. We did not have unprecedented depth at tight end because a number of guys we were counting on, we thought maybe we'd milk another good season out of Travis Kelce. He kind of hit the wall. We thought Dalton Kincaid was an up-and-coming tight end to target. Didn't really work out. There were a lot of guys who kind of didn't really work out in that regard, but it was important to get the tight end position right. Bowers was absolutely a right answer because he was going tight end 11 in ADP. McBride, I think, was going tight end 4 and was worth that draft position and more. And George Kittle, I had made the point back in August. Kittle is like seemingly never overdrafted and often underdrafted. And all the guy does is like, there are going to be games where he is asked to block a lot and doesn't run as many routes and maybe only sees 3 or 4 targets. And there are going to be times when he gets hurt. He's got kind of a checkered injury history, but Kittle also every season gives you a bunch of smash weeks. And I think it's more important to focus on the smash weeks that he gives you rather than like, tight ends they're duds all over the place, and you can overcome a 4 or 5 point tight end week, but there aren't many tight ends who can give you the 15, 20, 25 point weeks, and George Kittle can do that. So I think he's going to continue to be one of those right answers. But do we focus exclusively on high end tight ends next year? I don't know. I kind of want to find the right answers for 2025. And I don't know if those are automatically going to be at the top of the ADP list at the position.
Erickson, do you think that, the lack of depth at tight end this year is justified to carry over next year that will then in turn be wanting to draft higher tight ends? Or do you think, again, this is another thing where it's like we just can't take over what it was last year, and there maybe are good values because the tight end position did kind of find itself at the back end of the year?
Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the Mark Andrews season where like he looked like the biggest bust at the position and then he somehow just scored a bunch of touchdowns and
Incredible.
ended up finishing as a top 5 tight end, but it didn't really feel like that. And again, he was one of my guys I was drafting a ton of. So like the beginning of the season was it was an absolute wreck. So I felt terrible about that, but then it turned things around.
That's a
When I
good
was
fantasy thing too, by the way. I don't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to throw this out. That's totally like my Marvin Harrison thing too. Like the feel of Andrews, same thing. I had Andrews on way too many teams. The feel early on was like, boy, I made a big mistake. But then, like it really found itself and then it kind of came together. There are some of those players that regardless of what the end result was, they had that feel they carried on all season. That is definitely those two, Harrison and Andrews would be those. But yeah, please continue on the tight ends and Andrews and all that.
So I was looking back at my notes about avoiding tight ends and really if you don't want to deal with like you just can't draft an early guy. Like because the bust rates for these guys are so much higher where the early round tight ends that really felt like hits were it was really like McBride, right? And even he was kind of like, is this guy ever going to score a touchdown? Right. So even the guy that you felt like hit was kind of like a double, not even really a home run. The home run was Brock Bowers, and that's because he was also a late round tight end. He also being elite tight end. Jonnu Smith, top 5 tight end. He was free. You could have picked him up off the waiver wire. You would have been swimming in the tight end goodness. So I still think that, yes, if you can pinpoint the right guy early on, and that seems like it's probably just going to be Bowers from here on out. But besides him, there are risks and factors with all these early round tight ends where if they don't fire, like they're going to bust. They're going to bust hard and they're going to hurt you. And the thing that is the toughest thing about it, and this goes from my roster management standpoint, it was impossible to let go of Mark Andrews. That's why I had him on all my teams because I invested so highly in him. Like I see a month of him playing, like I can't quit on him now. But like Isaiah Likely, he's breaking out. What do I do? But because you invested, you're like, I can't cut him to just drop for Isaiah. Like you're gonna be bouncing back and forth. You're gonna be dealing with that headache. So I've kind of come to the conclusion where it's like, if I don't want to deal with it, I'm happy to miss out on next year's Trey McBride, whoever that may be. But that means I avoid the Travis Kelce's, the Laportas, the Dalton Kincaids, the Kyle Pitts. Like I don't have to sweat that. Like I'm not worried about that at all. And I'll just roll with, okay, maybe I'll stream Disley or I'll pick up Jonnu Smith. So I think late round tight end always has a place, especially with, guys get hurt and tight ends take on bigger roles when there are a lot of injuries. So I don't expect receivers to get hurt as much as they did this year. But I think late round tight end is always the approach to me that is going to be the safest and lead away from bust. Now you might miss, again, like I said, like you'll miss on the McBride, but more often than not, tight ends, I mean, we all get frustrated by the position. Like they usually let you down. when it's all said and done, you're usually going to be disappointed anyway. So don't pay for it.
And by the way, Jonnu was there were 4 right answers at tight end this year: Bowers, McBride, Kittle, and Jonnu. And Jonnu was a free agent in most leagues. And Jonnu, I think, was the 4th most frequently rostered tight end on championship teams behind those big 3. So you can still do it opportunistically at tight end and make it work.
He was available for way too long too. I remember just us continuously talking about him. Well, we got a tight end giveaway. Another guy that you got late in drafts because there was an injury. You could have paired TJ Hawkinson, ladies and gentlemen. You've got a chance to win a signed TJ Hawkinson Vikings helmet for free. He's got time for autographs now because he's no longer in the playoffs, and you could be the beneficiary of it. Courtesy of our friends over at pristineauction.com. All you've got to do is head over to fantasypros.com/contest, complete the form, and either download the Fantasy Pros My Playbook app, leave a review for the podcast, or follow us on X, Instagram, and TikTok. That app is at Fantasy Pros, and the more actions you complete, the more entries you will receive. We'll be announcing a winner right here on the podcast as we do. So if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, turn on noties, and you will be alerted when new episodes are up, and maybe you can get your prize. All right, the final ones here, little lightning round-ish as we finish off with our lessons. Bell's about to ring here. So let's get through these. 2024 did not have a lot of league-winning waiver wire pickups. I guess the first question is this an aberration? And I think that's kind of impossible to even know because it's subjective. But I will put out here that the only 3 that I could come up with, and you guys might be able to identify better using this list, going through the top 40 of most rostered players on Championship, I think the 3 big waiver wire pickups this year were McMillan, Bucky Irving, and Adam Thielen. And Bucky Irving being the most dramatic one. I think you guys did your award show. He was like the number 1 waiver wire pickup unanimously, obviously. But those are the only 3 guys I really could identify. Maybe we could pick another guy or 2 here, but do you think that changes what happened this past year in your approach at all, as far as aggressiveness, waiting a little bit longer? The year before it was you had to be aggressive in week 1 for Puka. This year that didn't really exist. Erickson, let's start with you. Any change to Fab this coming year, knowing what we know now?
No, I don't think so. I think this year was an aberration, like you said, where all the receivers, a lot more receivers got hurt than running backs. And what happens is when Chris Godwin goes down, like Jalen McMillan doesn't become Chris Godwin the next week. That's not how it works. But at running back, that is much more likely how it works. And because you saw less running backs go down with season-ending injuries, again, Jordan Mason feels like he needs to be recognized in some way, shape, or form. But because his stuff was all front-loaded, he didn't help you win championships. But he helped a lot of people recover from drafting Christian McCaffrey, number 1 overall. So had that happened in the second half of the season, we would be praising Jordan Mason. And that's usually what happens. Running backs usually get hurt in the second half, not in the first half and then come back. So, and similar to Adam Thielen, right? A veteran receiver misses the first half of the season and then comes back. So a lot of weird things when it came to injuries. I think that we're going to go back to more of, hey, a lot, and to Fitz's point, it was just like all melding in my mind. Like, yeah, the veteran running backs, they all stayed healthy for the majority of the season. The running back class was weak in 2024. The class is not weak in 2025. Do all these veterans run it back with a full bill of health for another year with all these talented rookies breathing down their neck? I'm not so sure. So I think that this year is a little bit more of an aberration with the waiver wire. I think you're going to see more league-winning running backs that you can pick up due to injuries in 2025.
Fitzy, anything applicable in the Fab market that from this year you would take over to next year?
Erickson really nailed it. The running back and the lack of injuries was kind of an anomaly. It's never how that happens. So we did not see the running back market was more predictable than usual because of this. And normally we see guys seize on opportunities, and often running back value is as much about opportunity as it is about talent. And we did not see a lot of reserve running backs get that opportunity to shine and become hot pickups. So it made the 0 RB strategy, I think, a little less effective this year, because a lot of times the 0 RB drafters who sort of fade that position are counting on some running back value to bubble up on waivers that they can seize on. There were just not a lot of opportunities to seize on valuable waiver wire running backs this year.
All right. Do kickers and defense matter at the end? When we look at this data, funny enough, like defenses, Miami was in the top 10 of overall championship teams. So that tells you, okay, Miami was there. But of the top 3 defenses, it's like Miami, the Colts, and then the Eagles. Like from a draft perspective, there's one that you were really in on the Eagles, but they were higher owned. The kickers, though, there are 3 kickers but they're all under 10% owned across leagues. And it was like Aubrey, Bates, McLaughlin. Like it wasn't like a dramatic amount, like one kicker stood over the other, but they were all kind of lesser owned. So it's a tough question because kickers and defense, who's interested in? I feel like more kickers disappointed this year than ever. It was crazy. I mean, down to Zane Gonzalez's Bing that just got in. Did drafting or maybe highly investing in quick pickups of defenses and kickers matter, Fitzy?
I mean, streaming is the way to go. Defenses and kickers are wildly unpredictable, not only year to year, but week to week. The Colts were a popular streaming target for people at the end of the season. I think it was a week 16 when they played the Giants. Everyone picked up and played the Colts, and they scored -4 points, and Drew Lock torched the Colts defense. Whereas the Dolphins were a popular championship defense. They had a layup matchup against the Browns in championship week. Didn't even smash, just came through with 12 points, but a lot of teams that were in championship games had them and thus won titles, and it makes the Dolphins look like they were some elite defense. They weren't. Johnny on the spot, stream defenses and be, one of the last people in your draft to draft a kicker.
Man, yeah, I completely forgot about that Colts thing. Like that was I've never seen so many people tweeting about a defense losing them a championship in my life. I couldn't imagine being a human being that tweets about that publicly, like you're crying about a defense losing you. But I forgot that happened. So it was big. Erickson, same thing. Kickers in defense. What do you think?
Stream. I mean, if you drafted the first kicker, you probably took Justin Tucker, and he was horrible. like the end comes for all these kickers. It's not worth it. And defenses, it's all about matchups, right? Like you could have drafted the Seahawks defense to start the year, and then you shift to somebody else, and you end up on the Dolphins and Colts to win your league. So I think I think it's honestly, it's kind of like freeing to be like, I'm not tied down to a defense. I can just cut and drop and do as I please, and I don't have to make these, should I roster 2 defenses? No, like bye. I personally have no allegiance to any defense. I ride the hot hand, and then immediately once they face a good quarterback, I'm like, goodbye.
Yep.
All right, last 2 quick ones. Who is the biggest steal relative to their draft costs in 2024, and where are you drafting them in 2025? It could be relative to this data or anything, but we've talked about ADPs, we've talked about championship rosters. Biggest steal, and where are you drafting Bucky Irving is what I'm trying to ask you. But no,
Yes.
you can put your own player if you want in there, but it's Bucky to me. But Fitzy, let's start with you.
Yeah, it was Bucky because he went largely undrafted. I was looking at his ADP last night. It was anywhere from running back 50 to running back 55, depending on the source. So in 12-team leagues with 18-player rosters, he was real marginal as to whether he would be drafted at all. So I'm drafting him probably top half of the second round.
All right, Erickson, biggest steal from this past year, and where are you drafting him now?
I won't say any rookies because we kind of talked about them already. So 2 veteran players, Jack Smith-Njigba. He was like around, he was a really late pick, and he obviously smashed. And of course, I like drafting him, and then I traded him away before I could benefit from any of his greatness. So that was very sad. And then the other guy is Chase Brown. If he gets this RB1 role, he has like a Christian McCaffrey level workload that they gave him. We'll see what ends up shaking out. But even if they draft somebody and it's not someone that we should be threatened by, Chase Brown might end up being a value because there may be a market that is scared off of potential competition. But the upside of his role, he could be the number 1 running back based on his role in the Bengals offense. So I think that both these guys are probably going to be in that round 2-3 conversation. And I think that's the price you're going to have to pay to get Smith-Njigba and Chase Brown.
Final question. It kind of ties back to the very top. We looked at the all, championship roster team, and we kind of talked about what was the standout, especially the guys that made the roster. Now, based on all the data that we have, how and what specific position, if any, would your general draft strategy change based on the data that we saw? Would it be, it's obviously not going to be defense because we talked about streaming, but, we saw what happened with the tight ends, wide receivers, running backs, quarterback, based on the championship data of who made it, everything that we've talked about. Erickson, we'll start with you. Is there a position that will have any change whatsoever based off of what we've talked about today and what we saw in 2024?
So quarterback is still late round for me. I think wide receivers are going to fall in drafts this year because of the RB renaissance we saw this past season. Tight ends, again, if you don't want to draft the headache, then just wait on the position. From a strategy standpoint, running back is kind of my big takeaway here. And it's still that I want to go hero RB no matter what. I can never be a firm 0 RB drafter because that means I'll never get Jahmyr Gibbs. I'll never draft Saquon Barkley. I'll never have the opportunity to draft a ultimate cheat code running back if I go full-blown 0 RB. Because yes, a lot of high-scoring running backs come in the late rounds. You know where they also come? In the first round of the draft with the obvious picks. So I always want to get exposure to those players. It didn't work with Breece Hall this year, but yeah, rounds 1 and 2 still have the best running backs. They're going that high for a reason. I always want to get exposure to those guys. So that's why I always like the hero RB strategy, and I'll continue to deploy it in 2025.
Fitzy, you're allowed to say running back as well, but any position based off of all the data from a strategy standpoint that might be altered, even just a tiny bit or significantly in 2025?
I think I'm going to be more willing to go early round tight end than I have been in the past. I've been traditionally a dumpster diver at that position. And to see Brock Bowers do what he did playing most of the season at age 21 with one of the worst quarterback situations in the league. I don't think I ever took Travis Kelce in the first round of a fantasy draft. I actually might be willing to take Brock Bowers at the end of the first round this year.
Well, class dismissed from your two professors, Andrew Erickson, Pat Fitzmaurice. Lessons learned from this crazy season using some fun data, looking back at ADPs, talking about positional stuff. You got it covered. I believe Fitzy's got an article on this that is probably going to already be out by the time this is airing. So if you want to get more of his internal thoughts kind of on a lot of this stuff, make sure you're tuned into Fantasy Pros throughout the offseason. Fitzy is going into hyper overdrive. Erickson and I, we are always rocking. There's a bunch of great content, more podcasts for the draft season. We're already looking to the new year. Sealy, myself, and Fitz already looked at a projected first round. So Fantasy Pros, we got you covered, my friends. And hopefully we gave you some opportunities to take advantage of the BP free. That's a promo code over on Betting Pros. And you know that TJ Hawkinson giveaway. So make sure you guys are locked in. Follow these boys on the social. I'm Chris Welsh. And thank you so much for hanging out with us right here on Fantasy Pros. And we will talk to you next time. Bye-bye, friends.